for folks to come in. My name is Anisha Desai, and I am a facilitator with AORTA, the Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance. And we are a worker-owned cooperative of folks that are all throughout the United States. I am based in California, and there are other colleagues that are based all over. And I come to this work through a connection with a collective of makers called the Field Building Collaborative, which is made up of some of the folks that are part of this gathering today. And the Field Building Collaborative is a group that has been coming together over this past year, made up of folks in the K through 12 digital fabrication and making space in the US who are orienting around principles of equity and justice, and looking to advance work that has an anti-oppression analysis at its core. And so wearing my hat from that work and crossing over to this space today, I'm honored to be with you all today as we hopefully plant the seeds of what will be the Fab Lab Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Working Group. I want to appreciate Lydia, who's working with us today and supporting technology. And so I will ask you, Lydia, next slide, please, if you can take us there. Thank you so much. The purpose of this working group is really to think about how digital fabrication, technology, and innovation can address, repair, and really begin to reimagine relationships and histories of inequity, and really toward the aim of supporting bold, brave, new thinking and creativity, or perhaps in many cases, a return, right, to some of the practices, the ways, the patterns that have been lost and suppressed over time. And the real purpose behind this is that this group and other groups like it can really work to bring consistent attention to issues of justice, to things that impact systems of oppression inside of the work, and giving attention to it towards via resources, writing, campaigns, strategy work, etc. Building an analysis together and continuing to hone and develop that analysis around global inequity, structural inequity, and what we're going to do together in the reclaiming and uplifting counter narratives and liberatory projects, which really we see as the antidote. If you could take us to our next slide. In our session today, we have just a little bit, we have about an hour of time together today, and that's really a very, very short period of time to explore the many things that we would like to do. But the idea is really to pollinate with some seeds for what this group could be doing and exploring in future conversations. Some of what we will do is work toward building a collective analysis around systems of oppression and their impact on our work, and really surfacing in this group what is important for us to share about structural inequity in your particular context, and what's important to share for our collective analysis together. We will take a look at some frames that have really supported, I think, in particular, drawing from some of the work of the Field Building Collaborative, but also in much of the equity and justice work that we do at AORTA, looking at a couple of frames that in this past year have really been instrumental in getting us to bold and creative thinking. Um, and then we'll close with a little bit of like what's up for this group next, where's the energy, and how might we begin to gather some information about how we'd like to work together. The way that we'll do that is that we'll start a little bit with some analysis. We will move a bit into kind of exploring two frames that have been helpful, and then we'll talk about next steps, and then there'll be a survey. I want to invite folks. We are a small group today, and we can really utilize that to our advantage. So if you'd like to come off mic at any time and share, invite you to do so. If you're not a person that feels terribly comfortable with just speaking up in that way, please do in the chat, type the word stack and I will, or your name, and I'm happy to call on you, or you can pop your hand up. Any of those things work here. And if I can't see you, please do come off mic and share whatever that you would like to share. And encourage you all also to say hello and greet each other in the chat, as we won't have time for a big formal introduction. I also want to just share and offer a little bit, a short moment to share some context about the current iteration of this particular workshop. This was not the original working title and kind of space that had been crafted for this workshop. And so I'm going to invite, I think, Sonia to share a little bit of that, so that we can ground in why we are in the format that we're in now. Sonia.
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Sonia. I'm here in Cleveland and excited to have power. But just to give you a little context, myself, Dorothy, Jean-Luc, and a few others started an effort earlier this year called the BIPOC Makers Collective. And the work of that collective is to be a space where makers from a variety of backgrounds are able to support one another and to begin to push some of these conversations around equity and justice in our efforts and in our work as a Fab Lab and maker community. Our group was invited this summer to support the Fab 16 planning team around thinking about how equity conversations could show up in this conference. We really focus a lot of our energy around racial equity, along with the intersections of that, and started to meet with a subcommittee that included Guillaume and Ariane and Rebecca. And so in working with that group, we came up with lots of great big ideas, but the reality was we didn't really have enough time to be thoughtful and to really do those things in a way that we thought would best serve the conversation that we want to have in this community. We were fortunate enough, as Anisha mentioned, that a few of us, Dorothy, myself, Sherry, and a few others that you know in the larger community have been working with Aorta, and specifically Anisha, around equity work in our field building collaborative. And so she was kind enough, even at a late request, to say yes and to facilitate this conversation today. The thing that I would also leave you with, that I'm grounding myself in today, is something that I heard Sonia Renee Taylor say today, and that is, even things that are not perfect can be valuable. And so while this isn't exactly what we wanted, we believe that there's some value in this, and we're really excited that you're here and have accepted the invitation to be in this conversation together. So thank you.
Thank you for that framing, Sonia. I appreciate that. Let's go to the next slide, Lydia, if you can. So just thinking about why this work matters, I think there are many, many reasons why this work matters. But I think two elements in particular to really highlight for us is that we are in an unprecedented moment of global transformation and reckoning around systems that do not serve us, systems of oppression that do not serve us. And that collective consciousness is continuing to grow, and that energy is continuing to grow. And so as folks who are in this work and in this field, we are also noting a surge in the visibility of organizing and creative efforts that are led by folks who are most impacted by historical and contemporary inequity. And just want to name here, saying specifically a surge in the visibility of those efforts, because it is not brand new, certainly not brand new that these efforts have just popped up in the past year or in the past even 5 years, right? And technology and our analysis and the ways of connecting with each other has grown, and that has improved the visibility of these efforts. And so that's why this work matters. And I think it's really important to come back to that in this work, because I think that particularly, and cannot speak for any other context, but the US context, there is a way in which what we call DEI efforts, diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, are quite surface in their nature, and can sometimes not focus at all on root causes of why folks have been historically excluded from conversations, or why folks who are most impacted are not part of conversations, right? And so the frame that we are exploring today, and with which many of you may already be familiar, an anti-oppression framework or a systems of oppression framework, helps us to really go beyond surface improvements, right? If we just get more people here, we will be in XYZ place, right? Or if we could just be more friendly and inclusive, all of this would be solved. And we know that that is not the case. We know that it involves digging deeper and looking at these systems. And the power of looking at systems is that we then can think that much bigger in terms of what we can transform, what we can create, what we can dream into. So that's really the invitation as part of this conversation. Before I zoom ahead, just want to invite anybody, if anyone is feeling called, to just share how this is landing, and maybe hear from a couple folks about what brought you to this space before I move into a little bit of like grounding and framing for us.
I can take a moment. Some of you already know me and know that I'm somebody who speaks up a lot. So that's one of the reasons I'm here, is to be able to lend my voice and bring in my perspective. In the recent years, I've been working more and more within my culture, and trying to decolonize my thinking, which is a challenge in itself. And so I'm here to learn, and I'm here to lend my voice and share support.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Ariane. Maybe one other person. What's bringing you here to this conversation today?
Hi, I'm Leo from Argentina, and I came here because I really like the name Jedi, because I love Star Wars, and that was key to bring me in.
I love it. I love it. We'll do whatever it takes. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And the J in Jedi is particularly poignant and important. So if you are here for justice, that's all the better. Great. So I want to do a little bit of kind of meaning making together and share some framing. And I want to share this framing from the perspective of aorta and what we utilize to frame up this conversation. And then I want to invite you all to contribute your particular contexts to this conversation. Next slide, please. So as we're thinking about framing and assumptions around this work, I mentioned that we use an anti-oppression analysis to talk about equity work, to talk about justice work, and what does that mean, right? What's underneath that? And so the first piece is that we understand that systems of oppression exist. And when we are talking about oppression, we mean the experience of being denied power, or the experience of not being able to determine the conditions and outcomes of one's life, right? And so systems of oppression are the structural forces that really give power to some and deny it to others based on their identity and social location. And so we are not here to talk about whether or not systems like patriarchy or colonialism or white supremacy exist or don't exist. We know that they exist and we live inside of them. But rather, we're here to talk about how they operate and how they embed themselves inside of cultural norms, and then what we can do to counter those norms, right? We live in complexity. We know that the vast majority of us both benefit from and are harmed by systemic oppression. And it is very rare very rarely as simple as saying this person or this community has privilege or not, or this community is an oppressive community or oppressed, right? And the more awareness that we can build and continue to build, it's a lifelong journey, to have empathy and compassion and understanding. That nuance is what is really going to help us toward building real equity. When we talk about systems of oppression, they are interconnected. They depend upon each other. And it is rarely as simple as examining one system of oppression in its quote unquote pure form, right? So because they depend upon each other and amplify and change each other, it behooves us to explore them as an interconnected system of systems. Dismantling systems of oppression will benefit everyone. They're fundamentally dehumanizing, even if you are benefiting from them. And because these systems are interconnected, then we know that the liberation, the freedom, the creativity on the other side of it is also interconnected and bound up together, and we all win. These last couple of bits, liberation trickles up. We believe that centering communities who are at the intersection of multiple forms of oppression inside of our work, inside of our organizing, inside of our projects, and our services, right, is always going to be the best way to gain freedom, access to basic needs, access to beyond, right? That starting there is really going to have the best solutions to blossom upward. And then lastly, understanding that blame and shame are not the core components that we are using to dismantle these systems, although they certainly have a place in the life cycle of change and taking accountability. But what we really want to center is taking responsibility for our actions, our history, the broader context, actions, and legacies of our ancestors. And so what we're doing here is in the process of building the skills to work collectively to see our liberation as connected and to work across difference. So just want to pause there and before moving on to see how that's landing with folks, and if there's anything you might want to share in hearing those assumptions or looking at those assumptions.
Hi everyone, my name is Megan Salgado, and I work for a Citizen Schools, an organization based out of Boston. And I think that the first thing I thought when I read The Change and Liberation Are Possible was kind of this like sort of cynical disbelief, like, really, I don't know, like, it seems impossible. But I think I'm learning how, like, that's exactly how oppression works, right? Is that you are gaslit into believing that you're not capable of change, or that the way that a system is created is how it's always been and how it always will be, and that there's no like way around it. And so it feels so discouraging, but to just such a simple phrase at the end there, like, is so like, you know, just revealing of like how possible it really is, if that mind shift is changed from like an oppressive narrative.
Yes, Megan. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, you know, I've been doing this work for a long time, and I have to believe that change and liberation are possible, so that I can get up every day and do the work and feel like it's not a performance, right? To feel like this is not performative. To know that if I can actually interrogate the norms and values inside of how we operate and ask where they come from, I can actually create new norms and values to move toward. And these systems are so embedded in our world and so embedded in our life. And exactly what you said, right? The pull of them is so strong that sometimes it can be very, very natural to think that there's really nothing else that's possible. Yeah, thank you. Other folks wondering how this is landing for you in your context.
I could speak from a specific context as an educator.
Thanks, Joel.
So thank you for the opportunity to speak and to listen and to learn here. My background is similar to Ariane's, I would say, and I'm coming to this with 15 plus years of experience as an educator. My background's in theoretical physics, and I landed into teaching, discovered that I loved it, and that maybe I could be good at it and make an impact. And over the years, I've been increasingly getting into project development, which goes outside of traditional curriculum. And so over the last couple of years, the maker movement and the maker culture that goes along with it has been foremost on my mind. And one of the things that I've come across, and all of us in STEM have come across at one point or another, with one degree of intention or another of understanding, that is the barriers to entry to underrepresented groups in STEM fields. So I'm also project lead for an AI initiative at the college that I teach at. And we see this very clearly. The word bias is sort of central to everything about what's happening in AI right now. There's wonderful conversations happening, and we're having them on a college-wide scale and among our partners across the network who are looking at the transformation of education and how digital transformation is sort of core to that, and to make sure that the barriers that have been there to entry for underrepresented groups, that technology particularly has enabled, it be removed. And one of the wonderful things about Maker is that it's all about democratizing and lowering the barriers to entry and making accessibility foremost. But I would say that the old systems of thinking and structuring education remain, right? So there's a lot of inertia that we encounter within the system. So some of the things I'm working on are looking at an sort of an entrepreneurial, innovative approach to getting some of these projects going, so that we can reach other groups. My particular interest right now is really about, you know, inclusivity for these new technologies, and how do we enable that? So maker is sort of one dimension. Another is, sort of trying to create bridging programs, and so working on some initiatives for that. But this is local, right? And what I'm most interested about a discussion like this, and being part of this wonderful sprawling network with so many diverse perspectives and energies, is how can we do this more collectively, right? So that the local innovations that happen can be shared more broadly. So I'm mainly here to listen and to learn, and then to take some of that wisdom back to my work, and hopefully to stay connected with you all.
Thank you, Joel. And thank you for uplifting the powerful potential inside of this work. I mean, it is really, really tremendous, the power inside of this work. To counter these systems of oppression. I think many of us find ourselves working in different spaces and contexts where we may feel like we have less entry into this conversation. And I really like what you've lifted up, because it is a powerful calling in to this work and how it can be utilized. I'm dropping the definition around oppression. Was asked to drop it here, so there it is. And I can also share any information from this, as we will be going pretty quickly through a lot of this content. And I will say that much of this content I typically would unpack over like a big course of time, right? And with each of us doing our own level of processing and integration and metabolizing of the information. So knowing that this is not that context, I'm really happy to share these materials out. Next slide, please. So I say that before this next slide, which has a lot of information on it. It's a giant angry octopus, and I'm sure that you have seen a number of different illustrations around power and systems of oppression. And I think one of the pieces of takeaway, or there are many here, and I would certainly invite your voices here as well, is that, as I mentioned before, systems of oppression are interrelated. Sometimes there are tendrils of core systems of oppression that we are not even giving consideration to, that are embedded inside of our norms and the ways that we operate. And that there are different contexts, right? And based on where you're located, the historical context of where you are, the social and cultural and political context, there are different ways and different intensities in which these systems of oppression show up. And so here, inside of this particular depiction, there are kind of three core systems that are at operation: white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. And some of the tendrils coming off of white supremacy, imperialism, racism, Christian dominance, and further underneath each of those pieces, racism, seeing colorism, nationalism, etc. And so I want to just take a brief moment here to ask you what is coming up for you as you're looking at this map of systems of oppression. Are there systems and spaces that you are quite familiar with? Are there other spaces that you don't give a lot of consideration to? Would just love to hear from a couple folks.
I think one of the things that always strikes me is how interdependent like all of these are and how they build upon each other. So like right here, obviously they're showing as sort of separate tendrils, but the reality is they're kind of like, I would almost see it as like a winding, because you have, if many of us, or most of us, would have an intersectionality in some aspects of these things, in terms of like whether it be race, religion, our level of ability, our age, all of those different things. And so as you start to get more and more intersectional, these different systems really start to honestly negatively impact, right? Or the power ends up you know building upon, each system builds upon the other one to kind of continually keep one particular person or group of people down. And some of them are much more tied together than others, in terms of, just thinking about class and in certain geographies. So like class and race go together in certain geographies in the world, and in other geographies, class may be separate from race or color. um, and then in other places, some of these are much more dominant in certain places. um, so that's kind of the first things that jump to my mind.
Great, thank you, Dorothy. Just looking at Jean-Luc's comment. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Oh, no. Oh, do you have a hand as well?
No, come on, Dan.
Okay. One thing that I will note, I've spent like this past year in an aspect that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, at least internally for myself, is with ageism, and making sure that checking the language I use to make sure it's not condescending or infantilizing or being patronizing, either towards myself or towards those in my communities. Reminding that mentors can be of all mentors, and those you look up to are of any age, specifically, and keeping that in mind as our participants are mainly junior and high school students, to empower them and take on to encourage them to feel confident in the space to take leads on projects, and then we are the resources for them to see their goals come true.
Great, thank you for that. I think it's so helpful to have consideration for those things that we sort of consider. I mean, there are many things. The way that systems of oppression work are basically normalizing particular values and what we believe and what we trust and what we think is good and right. And so it's helpful to lift that up and interrogate that as part of educational design and structure. It's really great. Thank you. Sonia, can I call your voice forward of what you shared in the chat?
Sure. I just was really struck by the adult privilege label out of everything, and spent a lot and just sorting through some things in my own mind, even as it relates to my own relationship with my children, who are now adults, my personal children. And then the ableism and the cisgenderism also came up for me. But what I was struck with right away was, what does the image look like and what do the labels look like in a more just society? And, how can I spend some time just, really dreaming about that, and maybe even coming up with what it looks like for me. I'm no artist, right? But I think it's really important for us to start to spend time in what we hope for. And so that came up for me right away.
Beautiful invitation. Yeah, and I would pin that invitation right to the top, right? Of like, what is the charge of any group that is working toward justice and equity inside of this work is starting with that bold vision, and knowing that it is possible. Really appreciate that. Let's move to the next slide. And what I'm going to do is front load a bunch of information, and then we'll have maybe like a short moment for folks to do a little bit of breakouts and then come back for some conversation. So one of the ways in which one of the tools that we use to talk about how systems of oppression show up for us in our work, in our institutions, in our daily lives, is to use kind of this iceberg metaphor. And it's been around for some time, and you may have seen it before. And you can really think about this iceberg in an application of any one of those systems of oppression that you just saw as part of that octopus, right? And the way that we can look at this and begin to work with this is, if we're looking at the top of the iceberg, that's just the stuff that is visible to the eye. The stuff that might happen between individual people that we can notice and tune into, the stuff that is fueled by individual and personal bias, right? A racial slur or joke could be something that is big and obvious, or something that is quite subtle and nuanced. It could be something that is conscious, like an assault or conscious discrimination, or it could be unconscious. And we know that we make a million small decisions every day, and implicit bias is the instrument there that allows us to operate without even thinking about what we're doing. And very often when people talk about racism or ageism or any of the systems of oppression, what we are referring to can be just the stuff that we're seeing on the surface, right? Like the most obvious things. And what we want to invite then is for us to look a little bit deeper, right? And so as we look a little bit deeper, and what actually takes up a bit more real estate in the iceberg is this institutional piece. And so that's the piece that's kind of under the water surface, can't really see it very easily, have to dive down to take a look. And when we're talking about institutions, and when we're talking about structural inequity as a broad frame, what we mean is all the systems and structures that influence and govern society. So healthcare system, educational system, courts, government, economy, etc., corporations, academic institutions. And these are really the spaces in which systems of oppression are institutionalized. That is, that they become enmeshed and in institutions and systems, so that they continue without individuals really consciously perpetuating it. And this is how institutions can continue to maintain and create systemic inequity and injustice. And some of the other things that we see inside of this institutional level are patterns, default patterns of how institutions operate, usually unconscious, but no less powerful or impactful, right? And these things can take place at the level of policy or legislation, and are often rooted in histories of slavery or war or genocide or racist social norms or inequitable social norms, right? And because institutions work as very strong forces in socializing individuals, and because institutions are made of individuals, so in turn they can be shaped by individuals, right? And they can be transformed by individuals. And so when we think about, like, where does that transformation actually take shape and take place, it's really at this deepest level, which is the cultural level. And when we think about the cultural level, these are really the beliefs that we've internalized without even knowing them, right? And things that are normalized and maintained as quote unquote right or good. And each level feeds upon the level above it. So we can track an idea inside a system of oppression all the way up an iceberg. We can understand if an individual is behaving or showing up in a particular way. We can understand what kind of institution might be upholding or co-signing those behaviors. And we may look even deeper at the values of the kinds of places and spaces we create that allow for these things to continue, right? And so we use this iceberg as a way to help unpack and kind of illustrate this as very complex, tangled web of oppressions as a way that we can really begin to like get a hold of it, right? Like it's not something out there. It's something that we can actually bring real close and begin to analyze for ourselves and analyze collectively as well. I'm going to pause there for a moment and just see if there are any thoughts about that, anything that's coming up for you as you're hearing that and looking at both of those images, the octopus and the iceberg. Specifically, I am wondering about what implications this has for you in your work.
Yeah.
Hi. So Jean-Luc Perit. Oh wow, there's really nice sound in there. Yeah, I was just looking at like the current image that we're on. I just wanted to kind of perhaps think about where the network might be in terms of like the classification. You know, we have individuals making up the network. And so, you know, I think what we're kind of tasked with today and then going forward is just sort of thinking about how, you know, the network itself is not part of this iceberg of oppression, but an iceberg of or sort of like building up the solution. So like understanding that the network itself is an institution, but then also like we need a cultural shift. Or we need to have a really good cultural base to be sure that we're not part of this systemic problem.
That's great. Thank you. I think that's right. Like if you are, I think it's two things, right? It's one, if we're creating something, we're building something, we want to be in great intention and awareness about what that's premised on. Like what are the things that are normative for us? Where do they come from? Why? And why are we building the things in the shape that we're building them in? And why do we come up against similar problems and patterns, right? And the other piece is like, we are not immune from being impacted by systems of oppression because they are all around us, right? And so kind of bringing an awareness to even our best intentions and our best work, and even folks who are doing the most visionary and creative and bold work still are drawn into the pulls of what is incentivized in our world, right? And so it takes a great pull to move in a different direction, and really appreciate you lifting that up. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, go for it.
I'm in the same room.
Oh, okay.
You've done looking a long time, so I was like so excited that he's here. So Rebecca, sorry you can't see my face, but I also, just so you guys know, I really want to stay, but I am one of the coordinators of the conference, so I have to jump off and open other rooms in 15 minutes. So just so you guys know. So I just think it's super interesting also specifically in this network when you think about like, is it an institution or is it the cultural piece? Because I feel like within this network, it really does, it like where we lie in the discussion is like, it is an institution, but it's not at the same time. So it's an interesting question of, I mean, that's a whole other discussion, but I think that's an interesting discussion to be had in the future to kind of like pocket that.
Yeah, thank you.
I think one other thing that comes up for me, I'm sorry, Anisha,
No.
is just the fact that in order, I mean, and people have talked about this, like obviously we're looking at Iceberg of oppression and looking at these sort of different aspects, but like if you had the iceberg of anti-oppression, the counter, response to it, I mean, it also means that I think to what Rebecca just said, it's not either or, it's kind of all. So in order to tackle it, and I think, I think one thing that I'm always aware of is, at least in the past when I've had conversations with folks within general maker fabrication networks, there are folks that are like, yeah, it's just too big of a problem. It's kind of a big global problem. And like, we can't really do much about it except to just do our best and have open doors. And and I think that, one thing that this breaks down is that there are lots of things that you can personally do as an individual that then, are just the surface, right? But they're a start. And then underneath that, there are things you can do to build institutions that are responsive and things that you can do to create cultural shifts. And the cultural shift, which is the deepest and probably the most pervasive, is the hardest. But certainly, I think that that's actually one of the benefits of a network, right? Is that it's not one individual just tackling it all alone, that together, this type of work is really challenging because it isn't just happening in one area of the world, and each place has like sort of different characteristics globally. Depending on your geography, you might be dealing with a different series of isms that in different priorities, in that way. And even if you tackle something like racism that, I believe is happening all over the world, it's still, there are other things that are, complicating things. And so I don't know, I just think that to me, it in some ways illustrates that it does actually, for us to make this change, it takes us not only making the commitment ourselves, but also working within the network to create that institutional cultural change, which is in fact the harder change to elicit.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Dorothy. Sonia, I see you on Stack.
I was just going to pick up on what my colleagues there, Rebecca and Jean-Luc mentioned, and that is this whole idea of the network and how these three levels, in many ways, they could be flipped upside down or, put in a Venn diagram even. And I think in particular, when I think about the Fab Lab network, it really grew out of, one individual who's a part of an institution that has a very specific way of thinking, right? And then it grew into this global entity. And so how much of an individual's understanding of the world and of these kinds of dynamics really make for how things really grow and shape and continue to grow on. And I think really putting more impact on what the individual onus may be and thinking about how we make the shift for equity and inclusion. It's just really fascinating because I hadn't thought about it from a network perspective until Rebecca and Jean-Luc made their comments, and just how this entire iceberg could be reimagined even itself. And what, it's like the chicken and the egg almost.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you. Any last comments before I move from this? Joel, you look like you got something to say. No? Okay.
Just reflecting and
Okay.
being impacted by everything.
Okay. Great. So, yeah, I think, this is such an interesting conversation. And what I have found inside of the work that I do, working both with organizations, working with networks, working with constellations of people trying to move a thing, that it is very, very rare not impossible, but rare that people run out of ideas around the institutional level, right? Run out of ideas around what policies to change, what practices to change, how to change governance structure, how to change organizational structure, how to share power differently, right? Like, we can come up with ideas all day long around that, because we are creative people and we are intelligent people, right? It is very often the cultural stuff that gets in the way every time, because what we're talking about inside of the cultural stuff is talking about where we're shifting our gaze, how we are moving in a different direction. Yes, absolutely. Culture and institution are interconnected. They're all interconnected, and they do support and reinforce each other. And it is impossible to create institutional practices and changes without really getting to the core of what's inside of it in the cultural practice space. And it's just an invitation to always be thinking about the norms that are informing the spaces that we are in. Why are we doing the things that we're doing in the way that we're doing them? What are the common patterns that we are seeing inside of stuck places? And why do those things continue to happen? And what would be different if we believed that something else were true, right? If we believed that something else were true. And I want to share on that, like, sort of like provocation, right? I want to give a provocation about two stances, right, that we have utilized in this work, particularly, I would say, with great intensity over the past couple of years, to provoke thinking about different cultural pathways and different cultural norms. And I want to share both of those, and I'm sharing them ever so briefly. I'm not doing them justice in the least. And so I just want to say that, but I do want to offer them here as some tools and as some grounding. And Lydia, I'm wondering if we can go to slide 10. We can move to slide 10, just to share two stances. So one of the things that happens inside of this kind of work is that we can get really stuck, right? We can get very stuck. We can get very worried. We can get very cautious, like overly cautious in our stuckness. Like, what if we go in a different direction? What's going to happen, right? And one of the reasons why we get stuck is that the current way of doing things is incentivized. Like, we get resources because we operate in a certain way. We get recognition because we operate in a certain way. We are more quote unquote productive when we are operating in a certain way. Things feel more effective when we're operating in a particular way. And so, just to say that it is possible, if we centered some different thoughts, ideas, values, it is possible that things could break open for us. And I'm not introducing these ideas in any way as something that has not been considered, right? Like, I know that the two things that I'm sharing actually come from deep, deep history and context. And so the first stance that I want to offer is a piece around taking a look at anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism, particularly, of course, in the US context, but globally, right? And thinking about the interrogation of looking at anti-Black racism in particular, and unpacking it and considering it to be the fulcrum upon which liberation exists. And this quote by the Combahee River Collective, a collective of Black women activists and scholars who got together and put together this statement in the early 70s. And this statement: if Black women were free, It would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. And what I really like about this invitation is that it harkens back to our framing, right, around systems of oppression, and understanding that Black women in particular are at multiple intersections of systems of oppression and are holding those systems of oppression, and that the dismantling, right, of that and the centering of Black women's experience inside of this quote and inside of this work might be able to open up so many different possibilities for creativity, for liberation, for possibility. And we already see that, right? We already see that when we center folks who are most impacted and can come up with solutions and ideas and address root causes that are impacting the groups that are most impacted, that we then are able to open up possibilities in so many different ways for everyone else. So that's one invitation, one inspiration. And then another place of inspiration, we can go to the next slide, is to share the just transition framework, right? As another opportunity to see what the impact would be if we centered different kinds of values. And the just transition framework comes out of the climate justice movement. It comes out of the indigenous rights movements from many different spaces, and really looks at what is the current model that many of our communities, many of our spaces are centering, right? If we are centering work that values exploitation, where our worldview is based on a consumerist mindset, where we are thinking about concentrating our power and concentrating our wealth, right? We're going to be operating in a very, very different way. We are incentivizing a very, very different set of priorities. And if we are able to think about what happens if we put something else at the center, in this case, what happens if we put cooperation at the center? What happens if we put that at the center of this network, right? And then begin to design a worldview that is based on caring and wholeness and relationships that are not extractive, and a sharing of power, right? Versus consolidation, and thinking about our planet and our spaces and our communities as spaces that we want to imbue with resources and regeneration rather than extraction. There's so much that can be possible there, right? And so holding both of those frames, I know that those are two big landings, and there's not a lot of space to process that. But just curious about when you think about applying either of those stances or either of those frames to the world of digital fabrication, what is coming up for you? What feels most exciting when you look at either of those frames and considering the work that you do? Would love to hear from some folks. It doesn't need to be a perfectly hatched idea, because this may be very, very new to many of us, right? And we haven't had time to unpack all of this. But let's just hear from a few folks. Oh, I'm so glad that your eyes are dilating with optimism. I like that. I like that. Digital Media Fab Lab. I'm going to call on you, but I don't know who it is.
Hi, my name is Caitlin.
Caitlin.
I am Caitlin. something that I think about immediately is the opportunity that exists for businesses, right? Because we wouldn't be doing the extraction without businesses kind of propelling that and pumping money into that, and the needs that we've kind of fabricated for ourselves through just, you know, everything. So, but thinking about regeneration, you know, I think of products, for instance, just on a product scale, how products think about the end of life of products, and how things will be recycled or turned into something new. So I've seen before, like planters that actually are made of biological materials or have seeds in them already. And so it's like, this can be something that goes to the earther. And so I think about all of the innovation that's already happening in materials in fab labs, and then also the processes and how that can be applied to businesses to decrease the amount of extraction and needing to mobilize products and things.
Beautiful. That's right. I think that is spot on, right? No worries, no worries. I know folks are dropping in and out, so it's all good. Thank you for being here. Yeah, what becomes possible when we can understand these bold stances, the just transition, the statement from the Combahee River Collective? What becomes possible for us? What did they support us to do in our work? And Caitlin just lifted up what we could be looking at in terms of business and business outputs and how we're designing right inside of that work to be less extractive. What else is coming up for you?
Well, for me, when I go back to and reflect on the Combahee quote, it's definitely around on the understanding of like who the most impacted communities are, as far as like all of the systemic inequality, and it's definitely part of the process is to actually center the voices and the worldview and experiences of those most impacted communities, so that we can then just move from this extractive economy to the regenerative economy. It's not something that we can necessarily just flip a switch and then we go into this whole new world. You actually have to, like, first you have to kind of like understand what those experiences are, and then most especially like the communities that are most impacted have to be the ones that are kind of the architects of the solution as well.
Yes, I love that. And I wonder, Lydia, if you could take us back to that quote. Um, uh, uh, yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Dan is saying a focus on including, implementing, exercising, and celebrating cultural values that relate with these stances, equality and production methods across the globe. Yeah, I think that is exactly right about folks who are most impacted being the architects. I love that phrase, right? And in order to have folks to be the architects, right, who have been historically excluded from conversations, there's a lot of work that is needed, right? For our own individual work to be tuning into what folks are saying and doing, a trust and belief, right, that things can be different and that things will be different, I think there is a lot of lip service that is paid to centering voices of folks who are most impacted. And then we say the thing and then we don't do the thing. We don't put resources behind it. We don't put energy and attention behind it. We don't put the work, compensation, exactly. We don't put the work in to recenter new narratives, because it is very easy to get pulled into status quo, right? Absolutely. We could be here for much, much, much longer exploring these things. And I hate a rush to the finish. So I wanna invite now, so kind of thinking about these pieces, the idea is really to seed some ideas, to get some creativity flowing, so that folks who are interested can come together inside of this working group to dream and envision and create, as Sonia was pointing out, what is the new vision look like, right? And so I want to invite somebody from the coordinating group to share a little bit about what next steps are coming out of this seed of a conversation.
Maybe that's me. So I'll just jump in because I also have another session at 3:15.
Okay. Yes.
And so Lydia is going to place, if she hasn't already, a survey in the chat. And what we're hoping is there will be the time and the opportunity for us all to be invited to have really more thoughtful dialogue and design around centering equity in our work as a global community. And so if you all would take the time right away to complete the survey, what we're hoping for are, I think, two things. One, a working group of people who want to continue this conversation and build this effort and partnership for our community. And two, a group to start to think about already, and it may be a subcommittee of the same working group, but a group to already start thinking about next week, what does equity work and workshops and opportunities as a community to talk together look like in our conference next year? And so that survey is really the vehicle for us to be able to know who wants to do this and will help us convene and build around it. I would also, while everyone, I would also encourage you to share the survey with other people in this community or in your individual labs or regional networks that you think would be interested. They won't be able to answer the questions about like what you got out of the session, but they will be able to make the commitment. So I think that is all, unless someone else from the team wants to add.
Beautiful. I also want to share my email address and encourage folks that if there was something that stuck with you from this conversation, or you want to have a follow-up about it, or you want more resources, I am so happy to provide those and to follow up with you and provide any pointers or advice or next steps for you as you continue this journey. And otherwise, I feel honored to be connected to this community, and I want to appreciate you all. It was a short bit of time, but you really showed up and engaged with the material in a way that gives me a lot of hope. So just appreciating all of you for your presence and for your commitment to this work, and do hope that you stay engaged. I think it can be very, very exciting in moments like this, that folks have the energy and they want to get together, and just encouraging you that it's that kind of sustained energy that we need in order to create a new cultural narrative. So please do stay engaged and inspired by this work. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your conference. Take good care.
Thank you, Anisha.
Bye-bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Good to see you all again.